Steve and Laura Kline had it all: wealth, a beautiful home, and the perfect family. But beneath their seemingly flawless life, a dangerous secret was festering. When Laura's affair with a man named Derek spiraled out of control, Steve's obsession with reclaiming his wife led him down a chilling path of deception and murder. What began as a desperate attempt to save his marriage would ultimately destroy everything he held dear. In a deadly game of revenge, Steve's sinister plan set in motion a series of events that no one could have predicted. Least of all him. In a quiet suburban neighborhood, Steve Kline and his wife Laura seemed to lead a picture-perfect life. They lived in a spacious home with manicured lawns, surrounded by other well-to-do families who all appeared to live in harmony. Steve, in his early 40s, was a successful financial consultant, respected in his field, often praised for his calm demeanor and sharp intellect. Laura, a warm-hearted woman in her mid-30s, worked as a schoolteacher at the local high school, where she was loved by both students and faculty for her kindness and dedication. They had been married for 12 years and had 2 young children, a boy and a girl, both under the age of 10. On the surface, everything seemed idyllic. They took family vacations, attended church together, and their weekends were often filled with picnics at the park or outings with friends. Steve and Laura shared the kind of bond that many envied, always seen smiling together at neighborhood parties or events. People who knew them well saw nothing but love and mutual respect. Yet, beneath this seemingly perfect exterior, the cracks had started to form. Over the last year, Laura had become increasingly distant. She was still present in their home, but emotionally she seemed to be slipping away. Steve, who had always been focused on his work, initially chalked it up to the pressures of her job. Laura had always been a compassionate woman, and teaching high school students could be draining, especially when the school year was in full swing. But as the months went by, the distance between them grew. She wasn't as attentive to Steve as she once was, and their conversations had become sparse, often limited to logistics: what to make for dinner, when to pick up the kids from practice, or which bills needed to be paid. Steve noticed the subtle changes first. Laura stopped looking at him the way she used to. The affectionate touches and quiet moments they used to share on the couch in front of the TV disappeared. Instead, she seemed distracted, always buried in her phone or immersed in a book. He could tell something was off, but he didn't want to believe it. He convinced himself that it was just a phase. After all, they had been through difficult times before: money problems, family issues, and they always found a way through it. But then things took a darker turn. Laura's routine changed. She started staying late at work, sometimes even taking work home, though this had never been her habit before. And when Steve would ask about her day, her answers were brief, almost dismissive. He noticed that she was going out more, leaving the house with a rushed excuse, returning hours later. The more Steve observed, the more he became certain that something wasn't right. It wasn't until one evening when Steve found Laura's phone carelessly left on the kitchen counter that everything came crashing down. The screen was lit up with a string of messages that were not meant for his eyes. He hesitated for a moment, the weight of the decision hanging over him. His heart raced as he unlocked the phone, his fingers trembling. The messages were from someone named Derek, a name he didn't recognize. As Steve scrolled through the texts, his stomach twisted in knots. The words were unmistakable: love notes, flirtations, plans for secret meetings. He felt a cold, sickening wave wash over him as the reality set in. His wife, the woman he had trusted and built a life with, had been having an affair. The shock hit him like a punch to the gut. He couldn't believe it. It felt surreal. Steve had always believed that their relationship was strong, that they had built something unshakable. But now, the truth was laid bare before him. Laura was having an affair with a man named Derek, a colleague from her school, and it had been going on for months. Steve stood there in the kitchen, staring at the phone, his mind racing. A flood of emotions overtook him: anger, betrayal, confusion. But amidst it all, one thought stood out above the rest. He had to fix this. He couldn't let Laura throw everything away. His pride, his reputation, and his family were on the line. And deep down, Steve knew that if he didn't act, if he didn't take control of the situation, he might lose her forever. But how could he fix this? What would he do now? He wasn't sure, but one thing was clear. His world had just been turned upside down, and he would stop at nothing to get it back. Steve's mind raced as the realization of Laura's betrayal sank in. He spent the following days in a daze, unable to concentrate on anything. Every time he looked at Laura, the images of those text messages flashed through his mind, each one a dagger that pierced deeper into his chest. He felt both furious and helpless, torn between confronting her and preserving the life they had built. But one thing was certain: he couldn't let it go. He couldn't simply accept that the woman he had trusted, the woman he had shared everything with, was now having an affair. As the days passed, Steve's anger began to simmer beneath the surface. He became obsessive about tracking Laura's every move, watching her like a hawk. He kept tabs on her work schedule, her social media accounts, and even tried to overhear conversations she had on the phone. It was during one of these quiet, tense moments that Steve heard the name Derek mentioned in passing. It wasn't much, just a casual comment as Laura spoke to a friend about work. But it was enough to send a jolt through Steve's body. Derek wasn't just a name now. He was the man who had stolen his wife's heart. Steve began to think about his options. The idea of confronting Laura directly seemed too risky. What if she denied everything? What if it drove her further away? No, Steve needed something more concrete, something that would force Laura to admit what she had done. He needed to take control of the situation. The problem was, he wasn't sure how. That's when he remembered Mark. Mark had been a close friend of Steve's for years, though their relationship had always been more transactional than personal. Mark was the kind of guy who wasn't afraid to bend the law or operate in the shadows. He had connections in places Steve didn't even want to know about, and Steve had occasionally asked for his help with certain delicate matters. Mark had always been there for him, and Steve knew that if anyone could help him solve this problem, it was Mark. It took only one phone call for Steve to meet with Mark at a secluded bar on the outskirts of town. The atmosphere was dim, and the air smelled of stale beer and cigarette smoke. Mark, dressed in a worn leather jacket, sat across from Steve, grinning widely as he lit a cigarette. Steve didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I need you to find Derek," Steve said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "I need everything about him, where he works, where he lives, what he does in his spare time. I want to know it all." Mark raised an eyebrow but didn't ask any questions. He had learned long ago that Steve's requests were never innocent, and he wasn't about to get in the way of a man with a plan. After a brief conversation about money and logistics, Mark agreed to take on the task. Steve left the meeting feeling a strange mix of relief and anxiety. The first step was done, but the path ahead still seemed unclear. In the days that followed, Steve kept his distance from Laura, pretending everything was normal. He still helped with the kids, took care of the bills, and went about his usual routine. But inside, a storm was brewing. He knew that Mark was working on getting the information he needed, and he knew that once he had it, he would be ready to act. Steve wasn't a man of impulse, but in this case, he had already made up his mind. He would stop at nothing to get his family back. And if that meant going to extremes, if it meant pushing the boundaries of right and wrong, so be it. What mattered now was regaining control of his life. Laura had chosen Derek over him, but Steve wasn't about to let her slip through his fingers. The more Steve thought about it, the more determined he became. He was ready to do whatever it took, no matter the cost. After all, what did he have left to lose? As Steve's obsession with Derek grew, so did his determination. His mind was now consumed by the idea of ending the affair, not by confronting Laura, but by eliminating the problem entirely. He wasn't just angry anymore. He was calculating, driven by a desire for revenge and control. Every interaction with Laura, every moment of normalcy, felt like a facade, a painful reminder of the life he thought he had. Now there was only one thing he could focus on: Derek. If he could remove Derek from the equation, everything would return to normal. Or so he convinced himself. Mark had been diligent in gathering information about Derek. It didn't take long before Steve had a detailed profile of the man who had stolen his wife's affection. Derek, it turned out, was a relatively unremarkable figure. Early 30s, works as a history teacher at the same school where Laura taught, lives alone in a modest apartment on the other side of town, and frequents a gym in the early hours of the morning. Steve wasn't surprised by any of the details. Derek seemed like the type of man who blended in, a person who wouldn't attract attention unless you were looking for him. And Steve was certainly looking. The next step of the plan came together quickly. Derek's routine was predictable, almost too predictable. He worked out at the gym every weekday morning, usually between 6 and 7 a.m. This was Steve's window. Mark had arranged everything. He had placed a tracking device on Derek's car when he was out of town on business, and now they could follow his every move. Steve didn't want to risk getting directly involved in anything too messy, too personal. He wanted the job done, but he needed someone else to handle the physicality of it. Mark, with his shady connections and willingness to do whatever it took, was more than capable. On a cold Tuesday morning, Steve followed the plan to the letter. He watched Derek pull into the gym parking lot, just as he did every other morning. From a distance, Steve could see the man step out of his car, stretch, and enter the building without a care in the world. Steve felt a strange calm wash over him. This was it, the moment that would set everything in motion. Mark would take care of the rest. Steve had already arranged the meeting place, a small secluded park not far from the gym. The timing was tight. Mark had a short window to act before Derek finished his workout and went on with his day. As Steve waited, his mind drifted briefly to Laura. He had to remind himself that this was what had to be done. If Derek was gone, she would come back to him. She would remember the life they shared, the love they built. The thought of losing her to another man was unbearable, and the only way to reclaim what was his was to remove the threat. He couldn't let Derek take everything from him, not after all they had been through together. Minutes dragged on as Steve sat in his car, watching the gym's entrance through the rearview mirror. He could see other early risers beginning to trickle in for their own workouts, but Derek had not yet emerged. The tension in Steve's chest tightened. Mark had promised to be quick, efficient, He would do what needed to be done without leaving a trace. But as Steve checked the time, his anxiety started to grow. Just as he was about to text Mark for an update, he saw it. Derek exiting the gym, earbuds in, lost in his own world. Steve's heart raced as he watched Derek approach his car. The next few seconds felt like an eternity. He took a deep breath and turned away, not wanting to see what came next. His grip tightened on the steering wheel. He couldn't afford to have any part in the actual violence. He had set the wheels in motion. Now he had to trust Mark to finish it. An hour later, Steve's phone buzzed. Mark's message was simple. "It's done." Steve stared at the screen, a mix of relief and something else. Something darker, filling him up. There was no going back now. Derek was gone. The plan had worked, but the sense of victory was hollow. Steve knew that once the police found Derek's body, questions would follow. His involvement, no matter how carefully orchestrated, would eventually come to light. But for now, he had what he wanted. Laura would never know the truth. She would never learn that Steve had orchestrated Derek's death in the name of reclaiming his life. She would never learn that Steve had orchestrated Derek's death in the name of reclaiming his life. As Steve sat back in his car, staring blankly ahead, he couldn't shake the growing sense of unease. Something was wrong, but he couldn't place what it was. The cold, calculated decision he had made had come with a price, and Steve wasn't sure he could pay it. The days that followed Derek's death were eerily quiet. Steve carried on with his life as if nothing had changed. He maintained his role as the dutiful husband, continuing to manage the household and care for the kids. Laura, consumed by grief and disbelief over Derek's sudden and violent death, leaned on him more than ever. She seemed to fall deeper into her sorrow, clinging to Steve for comfort, and he played the part of the loving spouse, offering support in a way that felt hollow but necessary. But in the back of his mind, Steve knew the truth. He was the one who had caused Derek's death. He had orchestrated it, and no matter how hard he tried to bury that knowledge, it gnawed at him. Despite the calm on the surface, things weren't as they appeared. The police had started investigating Derek's death, and their initial theories suggested a mugging gone wrong. The crime scene had been violent but seemingly random, with Derek's wallet untouched and no clear motive for his murder. Detectives were puzzled, but they had no concrete leads. They looked into his life, his work, his social circle, but they couldn't find a clear suspect. The case was frustratingly cold. Steve watched the news reports, careful to keep his emotions in check. As far as the police were concerned, Derek's death was just another senseless tragedy. But the feeling of tension never left Steve. There was always the possibility that someone would discover the truth, that something would slip and reveal his involvement. He couldn't help but wonder whether someone would connect the dots, whether the investigation would eventually turn its focus on him. The idea of getting caught, of losing everything, consumed him. But for now, he remained calm. He couldn't afford to show any signs of guilt. His family needed him to stay strong, to keep their lives as normal as possible. Laura, meanwhile, was unraveling. She didn't show it outwardly at first, but Steve could see the cracks in her facade. The grief over Derek's death was so overwhelming that it became her entire world. She would spend hours locked away in their bedroom crying, unable to focus on anything else. It was hard for Steve to watch, but he reminded himself that this was part of the plan. Once she had processed her grief, he would step in to comfort her, and the life they had before would be restored. Steve saw her looking behind them, and the life they had before would be restored. The affair would become a distant memory, a phase she would get over. Derek would be gone, and so would the threat to their marriage. But as the weeks passed, things began to unravel in ways Steve didn't expect. The police investigation continued to dig into Derek's life, and one thing led to another, until they eventually uncovered something strange. Laura's behavior had been increasingly erratic in the weeks leading up to Derek's death. She had started leaving town more frequently, staying out late, and had even made a few odd comments to friends and colleagues that didn't sit right. They decided to question her, and though her grief seemed genuine, they couldn't ignore the odd timing of everything. Laura had been involved in an affair, yes, but was she hiding something more? Steve's own behavior was starting to draw attention as well. He had been unusually calm in the face of tragedy, almost too calm. His insistence on pushing forward with their life together, to move past Derek's death, seemed to raise suspicions. The detectives began to take a closer look at him. They learned that he had a history of suspicious business dealings with Mark, and while nothing definitive connected him to Derek's death, it was enough to make them wary. The turning point came when they uncovered a set of hidden surveillance footage. It wasn't the typical kind of evidence police would focus on, but it proved to be a critical piece of the puzzle. Steve had hired a private investigator years ago, before he even suspected an affair, to keep tabs on Laura. The footage captured not just her movements, but also her interactions with Steve, and in the background of one of the recordings, the sound of Steve's voice could be heard. The investigators played the audio during an interview with Laura, and her face went pale. The words were unmistakable. Steve had been talking to someone about Derek. He had been discussing how to handle the situation, how to remove the threat to his family. The police hadn't been able to track everything at first, but now they had evidence of Steve's involvement, enough to begin digging deeper. The investigation took an unexpected turn. Laura, stunned by the evidence, was forced to confront the truth. She had suspected Steve of being involved, but now it was undeniable. Steve, too, realized that his carefully laid plans were beginning to collapse. The police had a way of unraveling even the tightest lies, and it was only a matter of time before the entire truth came out. In the weeks that followed, the couple's once thriving life crumbled. The detectives tightened their grip, and as the evidence mounted, both Steve and Laura were arrested, their perfect facade shattered. They stood accused of murder, each one facing the consequences of their actions. Steve, who had thought he could control everything, realized too late that the truth always finds a way to emerge. What had started as a calculated act of revenge had spiraled out of control, leaving both of them with nothing but the weight of their choices. For Steve, the tragic irony was impossible to ignore. In trying to protect his family, he had destroyed it. And in the end, the perfect life he had fought so hard to preserve had crumbled, leaving him to face the consequences of his sinister plan. As the trial approached, the atmosphere around the Kline family shifted from one of denial to desperate reality. Both Steve and Laura were facing serious charges. First-degree murder for the brutal death of Derek. The media buzzed with interest, and the small town that had once viewed the Klines as the quintessential family now found itself captivated by the scandal that had shattered their image. It seemed like everyone had an opinion, and gossip spread like wildfire. The narrative of the perfect couple had turned into a cautionary tale, warning others about the dangers of jealousy, deceit, and betrayal. Laura's initial grief transformed into a turbulent mix of anger and confusion as the details of the case unfolded in public. She was left grappling with the harsh reality of her choices and the man she thought she knew. What had started as an affair, an escape from her unhappiness, had now drawn her into a nightmare she could never have predicted. She felt trapped, not only by the circumstances but also by the haunting realization that the man she had loved had orchestrated the events that led to Derek's death. Steve, meanwhile, found himself consumed by the weight of his actions. He had convinced himself that eliminating Derek was the only solution, but now he faced the consequences of that decision. The once proud financial consultant sat in a cramped jail cell, stripped of his freedom and dignity. The walls felt like they were closing in on him, and he could hardly recognize the man he had become. The feeling of betrayal from Laura cut deep, not because she had been unfaithful, but because she had become part of the very destruction he had tried to prevent. The prosecution painted a damning picture of both Steve and Laura during the trial. They presented evidence from the hidden surveillance footage, which not only captured Laura's affair but also implicated Steve in discussions about Derek. Testimonies from friends and family further supported the narrative that Steve had been acting strangely in the months leading up to Derek's death. The couple's seemingly perfect life was laid bare before the jury, revealing a toxic mix of resentment, jealousy, and manipulation. Defense attorneys attempted to spin a narrative of their own, suggesting that the pressures of life, combined with Laura's emotional distress over her affair, had led to a breakdown that neither could foresee. But the evidence was overwhelming. The jury was not swayed by their attempts to paint the situation as one of passion and despair. The cold, hard truth was that a man was dead, and the responsibility rested heavily on the shoulders of the Kline family. As the trial wore on, it became clear that the couple's relationship had irreparably changed. They no longer shared the same connection that had once bound them together. Laura was beginning to realize the extent of Steve's betrayal. She had been caught up in her own web of lies and deceit, but now, standing trial with him, the reality of his actions became evident. Each glance exchanged in the courtroom carried a weight of sorrow and regret, a painful acknowledgement of their shared guilt. When the verdict was finally delivered, the air was thick with tension. The jury found both Steve and Laura guilty of first-degree murder. Sentences were handed down, years that felt like a life sentence for both of them. The courtroom erupted into chaos as the reality of the verdict sank in. Friends and family who had once stood by them now turned away in disbelief, unable to reconcile the people they once admired with the heinous acts they had committed. As they were led away in handcuffs, Steve felt a profound sense of loss. He had fought so hard to protect his family, only to destroy it in the process. The children he loved were left without both parents, their lives forever altered by the choices their mother and father had made. Laura, too, felt the weight of her actions pressing down on her. She had started an affair to escape her feelings, only to find herself ensnared in a nightmare of her own making. Every regret and fear purled within her was driven by the fact that she had started an affair to escape her feelings, only to find herself ensnared in a nightmare of her own making. In the months that followed, as they served their sentences in separate facilities, both Steve and Laura were forced to confront the reality of their lives. Steve spent countless nights reflecting on the choices that had led him to this point. He thought of his children, of the life they would never have, and the family that had once brought him joy. His dreams of a perfect life had evaporated, replaced by the cold, hard truth of their situation. Laura, on the other hand, had to grapple with her own sense of betrayal. The affair had spiraled out of control, leading her to a place she never wanted to be. In her solitude, she began to write letters to her children, to Derek, and even to Steve. She poured out her feelings, seeking some semblance of understanding in the chaos. The pain of her choices weighed heavily on her, and she yearned for a way to make amends, even if it was too late. As time passed, the story of Steve and Laura Kline faded from the headlines, but the lessons lingered. Their tale became a stark reminder of how quickly life could spiral out of control, how betrayal could lead to devastating consequences. They had once seemed invincible, living a life filled with promise, only to be brought low by the very secrets they had tried to hide. The darkness that had consumed them served as a chilling, cautionary tale, a reminder of the fragile nature of trust, love, and the lengths to which one might go when pushed to the edge. In the end, they lost everything, not just their freedom, but each other, and the life they had fought to protect.